I spent decades building my son's dream, literally signing my name on the dotted line. Then the day they demoted me to receptionist felt like they'd erased every night I'd stayed late making payroll. My name is Catherine Miller, and I am 62 years old. Before I share how they lost everything because of their own greed, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe toxic people always get the karma they deserve. But to understand how they ended up with absolutely nothing, we have to go back to... I started this company out of a 2-car garage with my son Connor and a folding table. When he first came to me at 24, hair perpetually mussed, eyes full of code and conviction, he said, "Mom, I can't do payroll alone. Can you handle operations until we get funding?" He sounded like every parent I'd ever hoped to support, earnest, desperate, trusting. So I did what I'd always done. I put my hands to work. I ran payroll, answered customer service emails at midnight, and taught ourselves how to translate engineering swagger into investor speak. Within a year, we had a prototype that worked and a small but loyal cluster of users. I balanced the books on our battered laptop, every subscription, every refund, and I negotiated our first coffee for space deal with a co-working hub. I hosted late-night pizza meetings in my kitchen, took notes, and made lists. I drove the interns to the airport. I ironed 3 polos for demo day because Connor's shirt had coffee on it and he refused to stop coding. Money was tight. I cashed in a modest retirement account to keep payroll alive the month a critical client delayed. I told myself it would be temporary. I told myself success would justify the sacrifice. A year later, the little company outgrew the garage. We signed a cramped lease in a converted warehouse, open floor plan, lots of exposed ductwork, a whiteboard that smelled like optimism. I had to co-sign the lease. The landlord wanted a personal guarantee because the fledgling ledgers didn't look like a Fortune 500 balance sheet. Connor swore to me he'd refinance. He swore the first round of institutional money would replace any personal exposure. "I promise, Mom," he said, and the trust that had always anchored us made my pen feel like a small, inevitable thing. I signed my name. I also signed up for automatic bill payments, rent, utilities, even a corporate credit card that I helped open so vendors would talk to us. We hired Kara, an engineer who slept on a yoga mat behind the couch for 2 months. We celebrated our first investor check at the diner at dawn. I made sure the founders' lunches didn't bounce, that hair dye stains were hidden before pitches, that flights were booked on time. I filled in as recruiter, sometimes teaching empathetic listening to a room of sleepy, brilliant boys. Quietly, my world shrank and then stretched around this company. My friends saw fewer Sunday brunches. The PTO I had saved up, gone. But when Connor looked up at me after a successful beta and said, "We couldn't have done this without you," all the small losses stitched into something larger, a shared accomplishment. Then the day came they called a meeting and labeled me Operations instead of COO. The title didn't feel like a demotion. No one notices titles when you're elbow deep in invoices. But the way row after row of people looked at me, polite but too young to understand, felt like I was an exhibit. A few months later, I handed our first employee handbook to HR and suggested a title change that read better for outside profiles. Connor shrugged. "Investors said we need a younger face for PR," he said, as if the phrase could be set in stone and carved into me. That cut differently than a fiscal setback. It wasn't about capability, it was about optics. After years of responsibility, the first public signal that my presence was only as useful as I appeared to be was a private kind of humiliation. For months, the little slights stacked. Meetings where my suggestions were paraphrased and credited to a younger man. Calls from venture partners returned only if made by the founder wearing a hoodie. emails that CC'd me out of courtesy but excluded me in decisions. I learned to bend my shoulders and answer the phone. I learned to find the humor in it because that's how you survive in an office that has been your life. I'd drop off coffee and watch Connor laugh with people who barely knew they'd been fed by me. Once, when I found a set of invoices mismatched, I brought them to the board and was told to let the new controllers handle it. They thanked me for my decades of service and handed me a receptionist badge printed with our logo, as if a smile and a badge could tidy 30 years of sacrifice into a neat, PR-friendly box. When the venture round finally closed, the office felt like an animal waking up. We hired a PR firm that suggested polish, new headshots, a loft photo shoot, video by a creative house who said things like brand consistency. They wanted a face who could do late-night talk shows and investor reels. Connor stood in the doorway of my makeshift office, chin up, and said, "Mom, they're worried board optics will scare investors. They asked if you'd consider helping as front desk so you can still be with the company." He laughed like it was a small thing. The HR woman across from him smiled like she was offering a flower. My hands stopped mid-sort through a stack of vendor invoices. There was no malice in his voice, just an assumption that my love was inexhaustible and my dignity adjustable. The board members were worse. Malcolm Reed, a man who'd made and lost fortunes and seemed allergic to empathy, said, "We want to position the brand for a younger, more aspirational consumer. Having the founder's mother as a public figure is complicated." He used the word complicated as if it were a diagnosis. At a private dinner, the lead investor, Priya, told Connor, "Startups need narratives that sell. Age is not a marketable trait." They smiled as if dressing me down was a form of strategy. I listened to them and felt my history deflated into a marketing checklist. Connor said nothing in that hour about the nights I had covered his student loan payments or the mortgage line I'd opened to bail them out when burn rates spiked. He did, however, ask me to play nice for the press. That week, someone replaced my nameplate with one that read, "Front Desk." A volunteer artist in a VR hoodie posed for an image with it, then posted the photo online with the caption, "We like real fam energy." The likes rolled in. My son texted me a single heart emoji. I replied with, "Congrats," because what else could I say without sounding like a relic? Later, alone in the break room, I overheard a private conversation. Two board members laughing about the optics problem and how Grandma'd be better handing out lanyards at demo day. The phrase lodged itself under my ribs the way a splinter does, small, persistent, infected by humiliation. 2 weeks later, when the press release named a director from a rival firm as Chief Operating Experience Officer and listed me in a sub-bullet as support staff, Connor didn't make eye contact. He told me the new title would look cleaner in investor decks. When I pointed out that I had been the one negotiating the lease and keeping vendors paid, he defended the change by telling me I'd done my part and this was his company now. His voice was steady. Arrogance had softened into a practiced poise. That night, he texted me a template of new PR talking points and asked me to post a photo on my personal Facebook celebrating the team. The last paragraph hit a different place entirely. "We need a fresh look. Please be proud." That was my breaking point. Only because it was quiet. No shouting, no slammed doors, only a competent, casual erasure. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and went through my emails. I found contracts signed in my name where my signature was used as security. I scrolled through bank statements, and there it was, my name on account authorizations, automatic transfers set up from my personal checking for corporate payroll, because I had once bridged a payroll gap. The list of things I had done to keep them afloat read like a secret ledger of favors assumed to be eternal. I could have screamed. Instead, I sat until the kettle went cold. The anger wasn't the point. The point was that inertia had been weaponized against my dignity. I took the weekend to look at old photographs, Connor with a cereal mustache, the garage whiteboard overflowing with algorithms, the late-night notes written in my scrawl about office supplies and vendor numbers. Thoughtful. The images moved across the table like witnesses. The more I looked, the more precise the realization became. My responsibility had been mistaken for an inexhaustible resource. I had been the safety net. They'd grown accustomed to falling without learning to catch themselves. Clarity arrived quietly, like a room lighting up. I made a phone call, not to Connor, but to my attorney, Mary Ann, who had once handled my modest estate work. "I need you to prepare a revocation," I said. Pause. Mary Ann paused only a breath before she asked the legal details. "You're sure?" she said. I was. That afternoon, I packed a small bag for myself, 2 sweaters, a paperback, my passport, and I packed a box of photographs for the attic. Size. I didn't take the framed awards because they already felt soft. Titles, after all, had been stripped from me in a business memo. I called the bank and placed a temporary hold on any automatic debits that originated from my personal accounts into company accounts. I told Mary Ann to draft a formal revocation of my personal guarantee for the commercial lease and to send it certified first thing Monday. Mary Ann didn't moralize. She ran logistics. "If they want to fight, they'll call," she said. Determined, somehow, the legal language made my head clear. I wasn't performing vengeance. I was refusing to be a credit line anymore. Before I slid the stack of paperwork into a manila envelope, I looked again at the lease agreement. There was a clause that allowed the guarantor to withdraw upon 30 days' notice if the landlord accepted. It wasn't foolproof, but it was a lever I had. Thoughtful, I also found the line of credit she'd helped arrange had been tied to my social security number, so I instructed Mary Ann to notify the lender that my authorization was rescinded pending settlement. Then I did something else. I sent a brief, polite email to Connor saying I wasn't available to work the following week and that I'd be taking some time to address personal matters. Sighs. He wrote back with an eye roll emoji and a "Take care, Mom." My heart didn't race. It steadied. The next morning, I drove to the beach. People assume revenge requires fury, but mine took the form of sitting still. Calm. Salt wind in my hair, I called Mary Ann and confirmed the certified letter had been mailed. The move was surgical and deliberate. I hadn't told a soul about this plan. Secrecy was necessary because any forewarning could have allowed them to cure the exposure. I wasn't angry anymore. I'd turned that hot, messy feeling into resolve. Satisfied. Later that day, my phone buzzed with a message from an investor liaison. "We noticed changes in corporate authorizations. Please advise." Mary Ann handled the tone, brief, legal, immovable. I watched sun pull gold across the horizon and thought about how often I had given people the benefit of doubt at my own expense. This time I didn't. When Mary Ann called back to say the landlord had received the revocation and asked for immediate security or a replacement guarantor, I didn't celebrate. Sighs. I stirred my coffee and walked along the shore. The landlord had 3 options: accept new security, let the tenant prove solvency quickly, or exercise remedies under the lease. The contract's language favored immediate action in the event of an unresolved guarantee. That same evening, a text from Connor came. "Mom, why would you do this now? We're on the verge of scaling." Bittersweet. The irony tasted like something bittersweet. I didn't answer. The decision was not impulsive, nor was it theatrical. It was boundary setting in legal form. Within 24 hours, the first domino fell. The landlord's attorney sent a terse notice to the company. Due to revocation of the personal guarantee and absence of acceptable replacement security, the lease is in default. Effective immediately, access to premises will be restricted until new arrangements are made. Suddenly, the office door had a new lock. An updated email to staff read, "Due to a facilities access interruption, all employees should work remotely until further notice." Curious. There was confusion, not panic yet. I was on the beach with a book closed in my lap when my phone started lighting up with missed calls labeled unknown office. Aboard that ship of rising panic, Connor's voice on the other end edged toward the frantic. Concerned. "Mom, they changed the locks," he said. His embarrassment and fear untied his practiced calm. "We can fix this. I'll call Marianne." "No, that's your attorney." He demanded I reverse what I'd done. I listened to him and felt only an implacable quiet. "You signed as guarantor," I said. "I revoked it. You knew the risks." Sighs. He tried pleading, then resorted to anger and finally to bargaining. It didn't occur to him that my decision was not about him losing a job title, but about refusing to be treated as an expendable resource. Within 36 hours, vendors who had previously accepted invoices for long net terms began calling collections. Surprised, one supplier texted a photo of a pallet waiting by the loading dock with the caption, "No payment, no shipment." The PR team, whose role had once been to smooth every public wrinkle, now scrambled to salvage brand perception. The press sniffed a story about an internal rift. Anxious investors asked for emergency board meetings. When the board learned our physical office was inaccessible and our landlord had initiated default remedies, anxiety turned to action. The lead investors' council immediately put a hold on the scheduled fund wire pending confirmation of the company's lease stability. The funding that would have replaced my guarantee was suddenly contingent on our ability to show clear title and uninterrupted operations. An unexpected twist arrived in the form of a small, quiet man I had met once at a holiday mixer, Jorge, the building superintendent, who had seen my handwritten maintenance requests for years. Curious, he'd been friendly, the kind of person who remembered employees' kids' names. When he saw the certified letter, he called the landlord personally and said, "You can't let them sit in that space with a default. It's a liability." That set off a bureaucratic chain that fast-tracked the padlock change. Jorge later told a neighbor he'd been tired of ensuring the UPS packages were safe for a tenant who couldn't file their paperwork. Sighs. The neighbor's retelling found its way into a thread that painted the company as disorganized and at risk, internal chaos made visible. By day 2, escrow accounts were frozen for a different reason. My attorney had also placed notices with a lender about my withdrawal of consent for the line of credit tied to my SSN. The lender, seeing the exposure and the revocation, placed an administrative freeze until verification. Concerned. The finance team, which had leaned on my accounts for balance smoothing, panicked. Payroll was at risk. Staff began to post messages in the company Slack in capital letters asking if payroll would be processed. Ironic. The irony was brutal. Employees who had once joked about family perks were suddenly checking bank balances and calling partners. Emails that once requested PTO now begged for clarity on severance. The company that had been perched for months on goodwill now discovered that goodwill didn't pay vendors or cover rent. And then the most crushing twist for Connor, one of our major clients who had been patient during earlier hiccups, took the revocation as a signal of instability and terminated a multi-month contract, citing force majeure clauses tied to operational continuity. Without that revenue, the burn rate accelerated into an ugly math the CFO had begun sketching with shaking hands. Sighs. Board members who had once dismissed my practical counsel now demanded emergency capital that couldn't arrive fast enough. I watched this happen in small fragments, texts, a forwarded email, a voicemail from an investor whose tone shifted from curious to clinical, and in each I felt less satisfaction than the steady, undeniable correctness of boundaries. Pause. They were learning to be responsible on their own timetable, and the timetable was merciless. By the end of the second day, reporters had started circling. The PR firm released a bland statement about temporary facilities access, while the board scrambled to secure contingency offices. Connor called me once more, voice thin with a combination of shame and accusation. Sighs. "You could have told me, Mom," he said. "You did tell me," I replied. "You asked me to be your guarantee. You promised you'd refinance." Pause. He didn't answer. I let the call go to voicemail and left it there. I did not gloat. I walked along the water until the horizon smudged and the tide pulled back, feeling the ordinary, clean rhythm of waves, evidence that nature moves on without malice or celebration. They came back not with apologies dressed in sincerity, but with proposals and panic. By the fourth day, Connor arrived at the tiny rental I had taken near the beach, hair in need of a comb and remorse in every syllable. Sighs. "Mom, please, we can fix this. We'll sign whatever you want," he said, sliding a list across my kitchen table. It was an inventory of covenants and promissory notes they wanted me to re-accept. He was pleading without humility, expecting rescue. Pause. When Malcolm and Priya showed up later at the door, two suited people who had once advised me on supply chain, they asked to talk. They wore tired faces and rehearsed contrition. I met them with a calm that was almost invisible. I poured coffee for Connor and handed him a mug without saying anything that would become a spectacle on social media. Calm. He searched my face for the revenge he expected, a scream, a tirade, a public collapse. Instead, I sat and listened. The men offered assurances, legal remedies, and a list of steps they promised to take to restore normalcy. Each promise unfolded like a flimsy repair job. Sighs. I flipped open a photograph of the garage and set it on the table between us. Connor's hands trembled when he reached for it. "No," I said quietly, and that single syllable carried the weight of my months of sleeplessness. Sighs. "I will not re-guarantee what you were willing to risk so freely. I won't be your backstop anymore." Connor tried bargaining, Malcolm tried to flatter, Priya offered a consulting fee for brand curation. They kept waiting for the soft answer that would absolve them. I did not give it. I didn't escalate. I didn't lecture. Firmly, I refused. The refusal itself was the punishment, the only dignified one I could deliver without villainy. They left with more contracts, more drafts, but without my signature. The day after they left, I made coffee and sat on the small porch of the rental. Sighs. The world did not combust. A neighbor waved as she walked a beagle, and I waved back. I clipped a few roses from a squat bush by the walkway, arranged them in a chipped vase, and felt an ordinary kind of joy I hadn't allowed myself in years. People on the team who had begged for clarity found new positions. Some left and found steadier roles elsewhere. Connor called sporadically, sometimes angered, sometimes apologetic, sometimes simply asking for advice on a personnel issue. Calm each time I answered with measured kindness and a boundary. "I can talk about the hiring process," I'd say. "I won't be your bank." Weeks later, I stood at a small farmer's market and listened to a musician play a song I'd loved in another life. Nostalgic, I bought a jar of honey and chatted with the vendor about bees. The company contracted by degrees, leases terminated, equipment sold, key people jumping ship, a few quiet lawsuits filed in the aftermath. I received no satisfaction from the cascade. Satisfaction had always been a childish thing. What I received instead was peace, a slow, nourishing thing that allowed me to sleep without tallying creditors in the dark. Sighs. The wound had been practical and public. The salve was mundane. One evening, returning from a quiet walk, Connor sent a photo of our old garage, now cleaned and converted into a boutique space, and beneath it the caption, "Starting over." I forwarded the picture to him and replied, "Good luck. Let me know when you need someone to sweep the floor." Chuckles. He laughed, which felt like a small reconciliation under new terms. Thoughtful. He didn't ask me to sign anything. He had learned painfully, as people usually do, how to stand without the constant safety net he'd taken for granted. I will not pretend this was easy. A mother's heart doesn't harden overnight. Sighs. It took a clarity sharpened by humiliation and the steady work of reclaiming the quiet dignity life had tried to repurpose. Now, some mornings I water the roses and make a proper omelet. I take long, unhurried phone calls with old friends, and I travel for no reason other than I can. Reflective. The house is quieter, and in that quiet I find that my worth is not in being needed as a credit line or a punching bag of optics. It is in the soft things, tea at noon, a call from a niece, the steady rhythm of my own breathing. They lost much, the office, a round of funding that evaporated, and the fragile belief that they could treat people as disposable. Sighs. I didn't take joy in their losses. I took quiet refuge in my refusal to be diminished again. If there is a moral, it isn't revenge. It is the power of saying no and staying steady. The world didn't applaud me. It rearranged itself. Thoughtful. I walked on the beach as I had when I sent the revocation and watched the tide come in, then go out. The sea does not pick sides. It simply shapes what remains.